Welcome. In 1851, a story unfolded so shocking that even hardened hearts were left speechless. Imagine a black child standing face to face with the very man who sold his mother away forever, then making a choice no one expected. Tonight's story is about mercy, pain, and a moment that changed history. As you listen, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe true stories like this deserve to be told with care and real historical research, please subscribe, because uncovering accurate, forgotten truths takes countless hours, and your support keeps these stories alive. In 1851, the life of a black child born into slavery was defined by loss before understanding, pain before choice, and survival before childhood. From the moment they could walk, enslaved children were treated not as sons or daughters, but as property. Their days were filled with labor instead of learning, fear instead of play, and obedience instead of dreams. Childhood, as the world knew it, did not exist for them. Families lived under constant threat of separation. A child could go to sleep beside their mother and wake up to find her gone, sold, traded, or moved without warning. Slave markets did not consider bonds of blood or love. They measured value in strength, age, and profit. For children, this uncertainty created a deep, silent terror that followed them every hour of their lives. Education was forbidden for most enslaved children. Teaching a black child to read or write was seen as dangerous, punishable, and rebellious. Knowledge meant awareness, and awareness meant resistance. As a result, children grew up surrounded by ignorance forced upon them, even though many showed extraordinary intelligence and emotional depth that history rarely recorded. Violence was normalized. Whippings, punishments, and public humiliation were not rare events. They were tools of control. Children often witnessed brutal treatment of their parents, knowing they were powerless to stop it. This exposure shaped them early, forcing maturity long before innocence had a chance to fade naturally. Yet even in such darkness, black children developed powerful inner worlds. Songs, whispered prayers, shared stories, and quiet acts of kindness became their refuge. They learned empathy not from comfort, but from suffering. Compassion, strangely, survived where cruelty was expected to erase it. It was within this harsh reality that the child in our story grew up, shaped by loss, hardened by injustice, yet still capable of a choice that would later shock everyone. Understanding the world he came from makes his decision not just surprising, but almost unimaginable for the time. The day his mother was sold began like any other, but it ended with a silence that would follow the boy for the rest of his life. There was no warning, no goodbye, no moment to prepare. One moment she was there, her voice familiar, her presence a shield against a cruel world. And the next, strangers stood between them, counting money instead of tears. Slave auctions were public, deliberate, and merciless. The boy watched as his mother was examined like an object, her strength measured, her body judged for labor. She tried not to look at him, not because she didn't love him, but because meeting his eyes might break what little strength she had left. He didn't yet understand the words being spoken, but he understood the fear in her breathing. When the sale was finalized, everything happened quickly. Hands grabbed her arms. Chains clinked. The crowd moved on as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The boy ran forward, calling out, but he was held back by someone who told him to stay still, to be quiet, to obey. That was the moment he learned how powerless a child could truly be. His mother turned only once. Her face carried a mixture of terror, sorrow, and forced calm, an unspoken promise that she would remember him, even if the world tried to erase her. That look became the last memory he carried of her, replayed endlessly in his mind as the years passed. That single day reshaped his understanding of humanity. Love, he learned, could be torn away without consequence. People could profit from suffering and sleep peacefully afterward. The man who purchased her walked away without looking back, unaware that a child's eyes were burning his image into memory. From that day forward, the boy lived with an open wound that never healed. He did not know where his mother was taken, if she lived, or if she ever spoke his name again. But fate would later bring him face to face with the man responsible, and force him to choose between the pain of the past and the weight of mercy. The separation from his mother did not end when she was taken away. It followed the boy into every moment of his life. Trauma settled quietly, shaping his thoughts, his fears, and the way he saw the world. Without understanding the word for it, he carried grief like a shadow, always present, never leaving. Nighttime became the hardest. Sleep brought memories he could not escape, his mother's voice, her final glance, the sound of chains moving her father away. He would wake in panic, reaching for someone who was no longer there. No one came to comfort him. In slavery, tears were not treated as pain, they were treated as weakness. As the years passed, the trauma changed him. He became cautious, silent, and watchful. Trust was dangerous when people could disappear without explanation. He learned not to grow attached, not to hope too much, because hope made loss unbearable. Emotional survival meant building walls around his heart. Anger grew alongside grief. It was not loud or violent. It was buried deep, burning slowly. He carried the image of the man who bought his mother like a scar in his memory. That face became a symbol of everything that had been stolen from him: family, safety, and choice. Yet trauma also sharpened his awareness. He noticed suffering in others more quickly than most. When he saw another child separated from a parent, the pain felt familiar. Shared glances, quiet understanding, and unspoken grief connected enslaved children in ways words never could. This long, silent suffering prepared him for a moment he could never have imagined. When fate later placed him in a position of power over the man who caused his pain, the trauma of separation would clash with something unexpected: his capacity for mercy. That collision would shock everyone who witnessed it. For years, the man who sold the boy's mother lived without consequence. He profited from human suffering, moving families like cargo and measuring lives in coins. In public, he was respected, seen as a successful trader, a man of business, someone whose wealth protected him from judgment. To the world, he appeared untouchable. But time has a way of exposing what power tries to hide. By the late 1840s, cracks began to form in his life. The markets that once favored him shifted. Debt followed profit, and allies disappeared as quickly as they had arrived. The same system that rewarded cruelty showed no loyalty when fortune turned. Illness struck next. His body, once strong, began to fail him. Long journeys became impossible, and nights were filled with pain instead of comfort. The man who once controlled others now depended on them. Pride faded, replaced by fear, the kind that comes when power slips away. Social standing followed the same downward path. People who once greeted him warmly now kept their distance. Whispers replaced praise. His past, once ignored, became a quiet stain on his name. Even those who benefited from slavery understood how quickly a fallen man could become a liability. He tried to escape his past by moving, changing routines, blending into new places. But guilt has a memory, and history does not forget easily. Every face he passed seemed capable of recognizing him, of reminding him of lives he had torn apart. By the time fate brought him face to face with the boy he had wronged, the traitor was no longer powerful. He was vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, the balance of power shifted in a way no one could have predicted, setting the stage for a moment that would stun everyone who witnessed it. Years passed, and the boy grew into a young man shaped by hardship, silence, and survival. Life had not been kind, but it had made him observant, careful, and resilient. The pain of his past never left him. It simply learned how to live quietly inside him. He carried his memories like invisible scars, rarely spoken, but never forgotten. The encounter happened on an ordinary day, in an ordinary place, exactly how fate often works. A familiar voice, a certain way of walking, a face aged but unmistakable stopped him in his tracks. Time seemed to slow as recognition crept in. This was the man. Older, weaker, worn by years, but undeniably the same person who had sold his mother. At first, disbelief took over. He questioned his own memory, wondering if grief had reshaped his mind. But the closer he looked, the clearer it became. The posture, the eyes, the nervous glance, it all matched the image burned into his memory since childhood. His heart raced, and the weight of years pressed down on his chest. The man did not recognize him. To the trader, this was just another black face, one among thousands he had exploited. That realization cut deeply. The young man had carried this memory every day of his life, while the one responsible had forgotten entirely. The imbalance felt cruel, almost unbearable. Anger surged, sharp and sudden. Every unspoken question, why her? Where did you take her? Did she suffer? Rose to the surface. He imagined walking away, or confronting the man, or letting fate punish him without interference. For the first time, revenge felt close enough to touch. But destiny was not finished. Circumstances would soon force a choice, one that placed the young man in control of what happened next. And in that moment, the past and present would collide, testing not only his strength, but his humanity. The turning point came suddenly. The man who once commanded rooms and controlled lives was no longer standing above others. He was collapsing among them. Illness and exhaustion had finally overtaken him, leaving his body weak and unsteady. In public, before strangers and witnesses, he fell into a state of helplessness he had never known. People gathered, but few stepped forward. Some watched with curiosity, others with quiet judgment. This was a man whose reputation had faded, whose past clung to him like a shadow. No authority rushed to help. No loyal friends appeared. Power once lost had stripped him of protection. The young man stood among the crowd, unseen yet fully aware. For the first time in his life, the balance of power was reversed. The person who had taken everything from him now depended on the mercy of others. Fate had delivered an opportunity that felt both heavy and dangerous. The trader struggled to breathe, his voice barely audible as he asked for help. Fear filled his eyes, the same fear enslaved families had felt under his control. In that moment, he was no longer a seller of lives, but a fragile human being facing his own mortality. The young man felt the weight of his past pressing against his chest. He could turn away. He could let the crowd move on. No one would question it. History itself seemed to pause, waiting to see what he would do. And then came the choice, quiet, unseen, but powerful. A choice that would shock everyone once its meaning became known. In saving the man who had destroyed his family, the young man stepped beyond what the world expected of him, setting the stage for a moment that would echo far beyond 1851. Even as the young man approached the fallen trader, his mind became a battlefield. Memories of his mother flooded back, the anguish in her eyes, the echo of her cries, the helplessness of a child who could do nothing. Anger, grief, and a thirst for justice wrestled with something deeper, the possibility of mercy. Every instinct urged him to act in retribution. The world had taught him that those in power thrived on cruelty, that pain should be repaid in equal measure. He could leave the man to his fate, let the universe balance the scales, and finally feel some sense of justice. The temptation was almost irresistible. But another part of him hesitated. He remembered the small acts of kindness he had witnessed among enslaved people, the quiet bravery of those who chose compassion, despite their suffering. Could he embody the same mercy now, in this pivotal moment? Could he rise above the bitterness that had shadowed him for so long? Doubt gnawed at him. Would showing mercy make him weak? Would the world see him as naive, even foolish? Yet he also understood something others might not. True strength is not only measured in revenge, but in the courage to do what is right when anger demands otherwise. He paused, breathing deeply, each second stretching into an eternity. The crowd around him held its collective breath, sensing tension but unaware of its cause. Inside, the young man weighed every memory, every wound, and every lesson life had forced upon him. Finally, the moment arrived for decision. In the silence, he chose the path few could have imagined. He decided that mercy would define him, not hatred, a choice that would not only change the man before him, but also leave a legacy that echoed far beyond the boundaries of 1851. The moment had come. The man who had caused so much pain, the one who had sold his mother, lay vulnerable before the young man. The weight of years, of suffering, of memories and injustice, pressed down like an invisible hand on his shoulders. Every instinct screamed for revenge. The crowd around them felt the tension, but could not see the storm raging within him. He could strike, humiliate, or leave the man to suffer and die. Doing so would satisfy the raw, long buried anger that had haunted him since childhood. Every image of his mother's sorrow flashed through his mind, urging him to finally reclaim some sense of power, however fleeting. But another thought, quieter but more powerful, began to surface. What if responding with cruelty only perpetuated the cycle of pain? What if demonstrating mercy could show the world a different kind of strength, a strength born not from dominance, but from humanity? The young man realized that revenge would bring him temporary satisfaction, but mercy could create a lasting legacy. He considered the man's helplessness, the fear, the vulnerability, the isolation. He saw a reflection of what life could have been if circumstances had been different. It was not pity that moved him, nor was it forgiveness in the conventional sense. It was the understanding that cruelty need not be met with cruelty. Time seemed suspended as he made his choice. The young man stepped closer, extended his hand, and helped the man to safety. Gasps rippled through the crowd. No one could have predicted that the boy, who had been robbed of his family and childhood, would respond with compassion rather than rage. In that act of mercy, he redefined the narrative of his own suffering. He turned a story of pain into one of courage, empathy, and moral strength. That single moment would reverberate far beyond the scene, shocking everyone who bore witness and leaving a lesson about humanity that history would rarely forget. The crowd could scarcely believe what they had just witnessed. Whispers ran like wildfire through the bystanders, some incredulous, others visibly moved. Here was a young man, once a victim of unimaginable cruelty, who had reached out to save the very person who had caused his deepest pain. The juxtaposition was so shocking that it froze many in place. People stared at the pair, unable to process the scene. The fallen man, weak and trembling, accepted the help with a mixture of shame and confusion. He had expected hatred, perhaps even violence, but instead found compassion. The contrast between expectation and reality left the witnesses speechless, as though the universe had paused to highlight this impossible act. Some in the crowd had known the boy's history, the tragedy of his family, and the cruelty of the man he had saved. For them, the act was beyond comprehension, a radical defiance of the natural order of revenge. Gasps and murmurs spread. How could someone who had suffered so deeply choose mercy over retaliation? Others, who did not know the full story, still sensed the magnitude of the moment. The power dynamics were reversed in an instant, but in a way that defied the usual rules of authority. The boy's strength was evident not in dominance, but in the moral courage to act with integrity in the face of injustice. Even the man who had been saved seemed transformed by the act. His eyes, once cold and indifferent, now held a flicker of shame, fear, and perhaps the first recognition of his own past wrongdoing. The witnesses watched, realizing that this single gesture would forever mark both lives. By the time the crowd dispersed, the story had already begun to spread. People would retell it in hushed tones, in awe and disbelief. It was a moment that would not be forgotten, a living example that even in the darkest chapters of history, mercy and humanity could triumph over hatred and cruelty. Word of the young man's act spread quickly through the town and surrounding communities. People spoke of it in hushed, incredulous tones, as though trying to make sense of something almost impossible. How could a child of suffering and injustice show compassion to the very person who had caused his deepest wounds? The story quickly became the subject of amazement, debate, and moral reflection. Some were deeply moved. They saw in the young man a moral hero, a figure who had transcended the cycle of cruelty that slavery and oppression had forced upon him. Conversations centered around the idea that true strength was not in retaliation, but in mercy, and that a single act of compassion could challenge the harshest societal norms. Others reacted with confusion or disbelief. How could someone forgive such an unforgivable act? Many wondered if the young man had simply been restrained by circumstance or fear, rather than motivated by genuine empathy. To them, the event challenged their understanding of justice and morality, leaving lingering questions about human nature and the capacity for mercy. Newspapers and word-of-mouth accounts began to circulate, albeit slowly, due to the limitations of communication in 1851. Those who read or heard the story described it as extraordinary, even unbelievable, highlighting the shocking contrast between the boy's suffering and his unexpected choice. Some articles framed it as a moral lesson, while others simply marveled at the audacity and humanity of the act. Religious leaders and community elders used the event as a point of reflection, often citing it in sermons or discussions about forgiveness, resilience, and the transformative power of kindness. The young man's decision became a moral compass, inspiring those who struggled with cruelty and injustice to consider alternative paths of response. Ultimately, the public reaction was a mixture of shock, admiration, and introspection. People could not ignore the story because it challenged their assumptions about pain, revenge, and humanity. In 1851, a single act of mercy became a ripple that reached far beyond the immediate scene, leaving a mark on everyone who heard it and raising questions that would linger for years to come. The story did not remain confined to the town where it happened. It spread to neighboring villages and communities, leaving a trail of astonishment and reflection. People found it hard to reconcile the young man's compassion with the cruelty he had endured. Across communities, discussions erupted about morality, justice, and the nature of human character. Churches became forums for debate. Congregations listened in awe as preachers recounted the story, emphasizing the profound lesson it offered. Mercy could rise above pain, hatred, and injustice. Some congregants were inspired to reconsider their own actions and judgments, questioning how often they allowed anger or resentment to guide their decisions. The shock was not limited to admiration, it also brought discomfort. In a society accustomed to strict hierarchies and retribution, the notion that a formerly enslaved youth could act with such moral authority challenged traditional beliefs. Elders, merchants, and even officials found themselves confronting questions about fairness, power, and ethical responsibility that they had rarely faced so directly. Families shared the story in homes and marketplaces, often pausing mid-conversation to reflect on its meaning. Children, especially, were captivated and puzzled by the idea that someone could forgive a person who had caused such profound pain. It became a lesson not just in morality, but in empathy, courage, and the possibility of human transformation. Newspapers and letters circulated the tale further, highlighting both the rarity and the significance of the act. The young man's decision became a symbol, a counter-narrative to the violence, exploitation, and oppression that had defined so many lives. Communities could not ignore the lesson it offered. Mercy, even in extreme circumstances, had the power to reshape hearts and challenge societal norms. By the time the story settled into public consciousness, it had achieved a kind of quiet revolution. People were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about cruelty and justice, and to recognize that extraordinary acts of compassion could emerge from even the most wounded souls. The moral shock reverberated far beyond the moment itself, embedding the young man's choice into collective memory. The impact of the young man's decision did not end with the initial shock. Over time, the story became a symbol of courage, compassion, and the transformative power of mercy. People remembered it not merely as an isolated act, but as a lesson that true strength often lies in choosing empathy over revenge. For generations, families recounted the tale to children, teaching them that even in the darkest circumstances, one could act with integrity. It became an example of moral courage, showing that a single choice could challenge social norms, confront injustice, and inspire others to reflect on their own behavior. Historians and storytellers who chronicled the events of 1851 recognized the rarity of such an act. In a world shaped by oppression and violence, the young man's mercy stood out as a testament to human resilience. It highlighted the capacity for individuals to rise above the bitterness of personal suffering and demonstrate a broader sense of humanity. The story also influenced discussions about justice and forgiveness. It raised questions that resonated far beyond its immediate context. Can those wronged choose compassion? Can acts of mercy alter the course of a life or the perception of an entire community? In answering these questions, the young man's choice became timeless, continuing to challenge and inspire. Communities, both black and white, reflected on the profound implications of the event. It was a reminder that courage is not always found on battlefields or in public defiance. It can emerge in small, intimate moments where personal pain collides with moral opportunity. The young man's decision became a quiet revolution, altering perceptions of justice, power, and forgiveness. Ultimately, the act left a legacy that transcended the individuals involved. It became a story of hope, teaching that even in the face of cruelty and injustice, one person's choice could light the way for others. In 1851, a single moment of mercy reshaped history, not through fame or recognition, but through the enduring example of what humanity can achieve when compassion triumphs over revenge.